All right, I'd like to introduce Mio Diaz. She presented and was on a panel at the GW OSCON back in the end of March. I was super impressed. I was at both her events. I think she has a really interesting story, life story, and a really cool tech career path. And um, I don't know. I think you're like super inspiring for anybody who is navigating a technical career. And now, man, I mean, I'm old, but I just don't even understand how a student makes sense of like what job to try to even go for. So I'm hoping you can help, give some advice or help us, work through what the heck as a student or a new career person or an old career person trying to do as we navigate these crazy times with AI and tech and proprietary and open and all that stuff. So yeah, without further ado, I'll hand it over to you.
Awesome. All right, so let me share my slides here. All right, so that was a really good intro. Thanks, David. So what I prepared for you guys is a, a story about me. And hi everyone, thanks for joining, obviously. My name is Mio, and I'm currently a senior software engineer in the open source program office at Capital One. And today, the the reason why I'm here is to share a story about a girl who was born with an insatiable appetite for more than what she was given. And I think that ties pretty well into what David was saying. How do we find out what it is that we want to do or navigate this crazy world, right? Um, so this is the story of me in mostly pictures. So I was born and raised, mostly raised on the island of Puerto Rico in Bayamon. But what you actually see here is San Juan, and also one of my favorite places to go and hide out when I was a kid. So that broken looking castle thing that you see there was actually my sanctuary. It's called El Morro, and it's an old fort. I used to sit there on the ledges or look out from those sentry towers, which you can't really see from there. But just to think and feel the wind. And I couldn't really help but imagine all of these endless possibilities looking out at that endless sea. So I'm the fifth and final child in my family. I have two older brothers and two older sisters. There's a really big age gap between my older siblings and the final ones. So it pretty much ended up feeling like two families. We have the two older siblings and then the final three. When I was about 8, my oldest sister left the island pregnant with her first child following her soon to be first husband. Both my sisters weren't really the best judges of character, especially with their partners. So in this instance, my oldest sister chose a very violent person to be her first husband. And because of this, my parents picked up, took us off the island, and followed her to Philly. While my family navigated that situation, I began to see how different America was from where we came from. The struggle for my parents to just find work pushed me and my other older sister to grow up pretty quickly. We learned English faster than my parents, and this caused my sister, who was only 2 years older than me, to actually become the literal voice of my family. She would call to make annual doctor's appointments for me and herself. She spoke to teachers on behalf of my parents or acted as an interpreter during those parent teacher conferences, and pretty much everything else you can imagine, everything else in between. While my parents worked super long shifts just in order for us to survive. As I got older, the differences between me and my other family members became more and more apparent. I started conducting my own experiments when I was in like first, second grade. One of those experiments was me taking Barbie dolls and cutting their hair to see if it would grow back. And I don't know if anybody's read the book, The Indian in the Cupboard. So as like a reminder, the boy or the main character in the book had this special like cupboard or cabinet that he would be able to put like plastic toys into and close the door, and then it would unfreeze them and they were alive. So that's pretty much where I was in my headspace. I was convinced these Barbies were like super tiny frozen humans, and they were just lying to us, and they were totally alive. So my theory was, well, I'm going to see if their hair grows after I cut it, and I'll measure twice a day. And once I get that evidence, right, to support my hypothesis, I'm good. But that was pretty much me. And other kids, are like, oh, let's read books and play with stuff like a normal human. But these experiments were first of many. I had this insatiable appetite for learning and just a lot of curiosity. So I would find ways to stay after school or just walk to public libraries just to sit in between the stacks and pick random books and devour like every word. And this is while my siblings continued to live their regular life by going to school, making friends, playing sports. So for me, I couldn't help but feel like my life was a prison. I began to feel lonelier and lonelier as no one was around me, was able to relate. My parents really couldn't figure out how to help me. So this is where I began jumping between family homes. And eventually I was emancipated from my parents when I was 14. So emancipation for me, it meant that I was free from my prison. The life where people, friends, and relatives would laugh at me when I would tell them all of my hopes and dreams, that was gone now. I wanted to be everything. I wanted to be a doctor. I wanted to create robots or own a hotel or be a scientist or whatever. And I was constantly told so many times by people around me that it's just not really things that people like us could be or could have. So I went back to live on the island with a couple family members and eventually came back to the States to finish high school. And at this point, I knew I wanted to keep learning, and university was the only way to keep feeding that hunger for knowledge. And no one in my family had ever gone or even considered going to university, but it didn't really matter. I figured this was my destiny. So I would go to school, I would study science, then medicine, and I would go and become a Doctors Without Borders. I would travel all over the world. I would help people save lives and make an impact. That was my destiny. So that path forward led to Penn State. And here is where I was planning on joining a special program called the 3+1, which was my senior year at Penn State, would actually also be my first year at medical school. It was an accelerated program. And this would be at Penn State Hershey Medical. So I was accepted into my major, developmental and genetic biology, and that's where this chapter in my journey began. At this point, I was pretty obsessed with science and just research and stuff in general, but was still an outsider in many of my classes. Often, I was the only female in those classes. Uh, the worst experience I can remember was the first day of my physics class. The lab is huge. There's tons of tables, and each table had four chairs. And the table housed, other equipment like computers and stuff like that. Um, so I was one of the first to jump into the lab and grabbed a seat at one of the empty tables, and that was super easy because there was maybe like two other people there. So as the room kept filling in, the professor asked the students to go and find seats. So far, I was still the only female in the class, which is totally fine, whatever. Um, and eventually, the tables all around me were filled except mine. So I still had some three seats remaining. And as the remaining few students began to trickle in, they would begin walking towards my table. And as I would watch them get closer, I kept thinking, super, awesome, yay, like people to work with, really cool. Um, and then, they would grab the chair, pull it out, and I'm like, cool, awesome, like about to introduce myself. And without making any eye contact with me, they would pull out that chair, grab it, and quickly take it to a different table and sit there. And so, as the final person entered the room and did the exact same thing, all three chairs were gone from my table, and all and some of the other tables were like overfilled. That's when the professor stopped and and said, you know, three people, you need to move over to that table, and she isn't gonna bite, right? And I still ended up being the only female in that class, but made some pretty good friends after that. But that end result was just an increase in the desire to keep fighting, right? I decided I had to prove myself to everyone, right? I had to show them that this, I'm someone that people should want to sit at a table, with, right? But that was the end result. And of course, after a couple of not so bad but similar experiences, I was ready for a break. And uh, you know, we got that. And a couple weeks before the spring semester began, the break felt like it ended a bit too quickly. But what I really didn't know was the day before my second semester began, everything was going to change. So on January 15th, which was the day before my second semester, which is the spring semester, my older sister, who's 2 years older than me, and her 5-year-old daughter, my niece, were murdered by her ex-fiance. And I told you before, my sisters weren't very good judges of character, especially with horrible taste in men. So of course that event completely changed the course of my life. And like I'm sure many others in the call or in the world or in general do things to please or impress or prove things to other people. And that was me. I always wanted to prove that I was good enough to others, that I was worthy, that I was smart enough. But of course, after my sister died, I stopped. I decided the only person that I needed to impress was myself. And that's where my new life began. Um, and as I told you before, I have two older brothers and two older sisters. So at this point in my life, my oldest sister and my older brothers, they already had families. And so when my sister died, she was the one who held our entire family together. She was the reason I was able to get into college. She became my legal guardian when I was 16, just so I can come back to the States and graduate high school by being homeschooled. She planned family events. She did everything. Um, and the last time I had seen her was the day before she died, where we made super simple plans. We were going to get haircuts before I went back to school. And that was it. So, of course, when she died, her death caused a huge change, not just in me, but it also broke my entire family. So I took the semester off thinking, cool, that'd be enough. Obviously I can get over this, right? And of course it wasn't. Nothing felt the same. The person I was, the person who was born on December 18th, it just, that wasn't me. That person died that day with them. So January 15th, in my mind, became my second birthday. It was the day that my new life began, this life where I had to learn how to live without my sister protecting me from the world. So going back to class after losing them made me realize that the whole proving things to other people, like I said, wasn't really a big motivator anymore. And I realized that actually was a big motivator for me. So I wasn't sure what I was doing at school. I had no desire to continue. So eventually I dropped out of school, and in my final semester, and just a few credits shy, 10 credits pretty much shy of my bio degree, I decided that I no longer wanted to be a doctor. I didn't want to save people because the only two people I did want to save were already gone. So, of course, at this point, I'm lost. I have no idea what to do with my life, no clue where to go. And the one thing I knew I needed to do was to find a way to survive. So, of course, at this point, I'm not going to school, so I need money, right? So during college, I had a job as a Dell Computers and Microsoft brand rep for the campus. So my job as a brand rep was to host launch events and parties when new devices, like the Xbox or a new Microsoft Office, like a new version of that came out, They would give me, cool swag and stuff to just promote like these new products. They also gave me a couple computers to use in class and to talk pretty much to anyone who would listen about these brands, Microsoft Office or just Dell or whatever. But when I dropped out, I had to leave that role since it was only available for current students. So with my background, I figured, why not just go work at the Geek Squad? Um, and plus, I had a computer science minor when I was still in school, so this made sense to me. Computer's cool, like that makes sense. Um, and of course, later, if you remember, you can ask me what I was planning on doing with a genetics and a comp sci minor later, degree in genetics and comp sci minor. But the new job is what began to fuel the fire for learning again. I got to diagnose and fix computers, similar to a patient. And I learned so much from my now husband, who was a senior agent at the precinct during that time. And yes, that's what they called the Geek Squad back then. It was a precinct, and the workers were agents. You could be a double agent, whatever. It was really cool. You actually could like earn a police style badge once you hit 5 years or 10 years. The culture was interesting. But anyway, eventually, my husband got an email from a recruiter that allowed us to move to San Francisco, where I got to live the California dream. Here is where I was able to work for a couple tech companies who gave me the chance to explore so many different roles. I got to go back to the Geek Squad and be one of those double agents, where I was able to drive around to different locations and help people in their homes set up small business infrastructure, network servers, etc., or in their homes to set up their computers, stuff like that. And this was like in the Oakland area. And then I worked at Apple, where a good chunk of the Northern California area, the top area, was a part of like my territory. And it was pretty much focused on these authorized seller or reseller stores. So think like when you go to Best Buy or like Target or something, you see these like mini Apple stores in there, and you can buy Apple products. It's that. Um, so my entire role was pretty much to act as a bridge between Apple and these stores. Um, and so those little Apple experiences that if you walk there, it looks like an Apple store, like a mini Apple store. And my job was to make sure that that's exactly what it was, a mini Apple store. So it maintained the culture, and it was true to the brand, the look and feel of it. Anybody who was working in that space had to be pretty much like, an Apple type employee, with the same values. And yeah, and I got to set up a lot of those stores too, which was pretty fun. Um, and then eventually I left Apple to go join Facebook after I was recruited for my love and familiarity with Linux. I mainly supported the Oculus team. They had a few special setups on site for their development that required special computers and things like that, and their own devices that were special and custom built, some by me, that they used for their testing and development, all ran various forms of Linux and stuff. And so that's what I got to mainly do there. But eventually, I left San Francisco and my role at Facebook to go live in Germany for a few months while my husband worked on a special project. But eventually, we came back to Northern California, and my mind was set. I I wanted to move back east to be closer to family. But then that's when I got the call from Capital One. So you aren't the normal type of candidate we go for, but I was challenged to think outside of the box. That's what the recruiter said to me after I picked up the phone. Uh, and of course, so many things are running through my brain. What does this mean? What is not normal about me? But cool, thanks for the call, I guess. Uh, but eventually I found out that the person who challenged her was my soon to be vice president. She was VP of technology at the time. She has since left the company, but her challenge came from her strength as a leader in diversity and inclusion. She wanted to look for people who are non-traditional, people who didn't fit inside of that box, who may need a chance, but often are overlooked. She would later become the person who would also lead me through the darkness and the tunnel that was my grief. After I joined the San Francisco office, she and a few people from her leadership team that joined from a previous company, they helped me find myself again. Eventually, I did end up moving back to the East Coast by taking another role, still under the same VP, but to the headquarters, which is based in Virginia, which is where I am now. So the things that I learned in California that I took with me are that loving to learn, moving fast, and breaking stuff, the hacking culture is highly encouraged. No matter what you do, there's always, or what you want to do, there's always a way for you to get it done. And computer code is just like human code. Genetics is software engineering, but for the human body. So after accepting that new role, I began to see a trend as the years went by. I started on a team doing a certain role or task, and that was exciting. And then about a year or maybe two went by, I got bored and I wanted to learn something new. And since the role became routine, it just it wasn't what I wanted anymore. And this just continued to happen. And of course, like if you play video games, the way I kept thinking about it was that role was a specific skill, right? In like my skills bar, and I maxed that skill. There's no point to continue doing this thing. So now it's like, okay, well, I have all these other underdeveloped skills. Where can I go to increase these skills, or just maybe add another one, right, to that under or undeveloped, space. Um, and so during my second year, my the same VP came to Virginia for a site visit. And I remember this site visit because it was around the time that Capital One had just launched their Savor credit card, which focused on, like family and restaurants and points for eating at restaurants and going to events and stuff. And Neil Patrick Harris was actually the spokesperson for this card. So he actually was doing a like a fireside chat. So it was him and his husband. They came to the office and they were asked a bunch of questions just about life in general. And so during that chat, Neil's husband, David, he talked about how his mother had passed and left him a small inheritance and, of course, a black hole of grief. His story was pretty much just like mine. He lost someone important. He questioned whether he was on the right path. He asked himself, what makes me happy? And the question to that answer, at least for him, was cooking. And so he decided to use the money, go to culinary school, become a chef. And that was his passion, and that makes him happy. So after that event, my VP came over to my building to have a catch up, a chat with me. And that's where I told her about that part of the story where David and I we shared something similar. And then I told her my story. And then I told her about constantly carrying the regrets of not finishing school. Because at least the way that I felt about it was my sister's ex-fiance, he didn't just take my sister and my niece from me, but he took my future and the person that I was supposed to be. And so that's when my VP said, no, you're going to graduate and I'll make sure of it. And after accepting her offer, I spent my year 2 through 5 at the company working full time and going to school full time, where I actually completed my final credits for my initial degree. But then I also decided that I was going to get a complete different second degree in software engineering because why not, right? This, whatever. Obviously, I had tons of time, nothing to do. Um, so working full time and going to school full time, not really for the faint of heart. Um, but while I had a ton of people cheering me on, there were other people doing the complete opposite. Sometimes, yes, they were my manager. And these people, who were, at least in my opinion, meant to lead me down the right path, treated me like another tool in their toolkit, making it, making their support of my dreams conditional as long as I fulfilled the tasks that they wanted. Um, so there were days where I truly doubted myself and whether I can actually complete this thing that I set out to do. But as every semester passed, I became more and more sure that I was on the right path. And to me, software engineering is like magic, right? You have this ability to wave your wand, or in this case, click on your keyboard and create anything from nothing. The only enemy in this space is a blinking cursor, at least when you're doing things on your own. So as the days became weeks and the weeks became months in this new life, my heart does continue to slowly heal. I don't think it'll become the same shape or the same size as it was before, but at least the scars will always remind me of the things that I have achieved. So now I've told you the story of a girl who never stopped wanting more for herself, even when she felt unwanted, out of her depths, and alone. What I hope you take from this story is that change is inevitable, and don't wait for someone to force you into realizing that the path you are on isn't the one that's right for you now or in general. So to be bold, change often, and want more than what you're given. Stay constantly learning and remember that it's never too late to restart your journey. So embrace the challenge. And that's the story of me. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Mia. That was amazing.
What's the next challenge?
um, I mean, there's so many things that I want now. One of the things is there's a lot of AI stuff and machine learning and finding. I have a couple thoughts on how it can help make a lot of things easier for a lot of people. So I think that's the next thing, figuring out how to use what all the new emerging technologies to make things better.
Do you use AI and Copilot and things like those as you program right now?
Um, yeah, we have them available internally, and Copilot is something, yeah, that I use, but um for basic like suggestions, like there are just certain things that you're gonna do. It makes things so much faster. I think it's amazing.
Do you worry about it replacing your job, or are you pretty confident it'll take too long?
Um, I don't think AI would be able to take my job until it can learn how to rationalize and think the same way that I do, right? So there's like a huge problem solving aspect of things. It might be able to code things really fast, but I think the only thing it's going to do is it'll make it, it'll allow certain, engineers more time to focus on some more bigger picture things, and less about like, oh, cool, I just spent like the past 2 weeks writing integration tests, right? I feel like that's not really something that I really want to do. But it would be really cool to be able to solve like those bigger problems. Or yeah, I don't know, figure out a way where robotics, um, how you can like codify human emotion and rational thought, I guess that would be interesting.
No small task. Can do that next weekend, maybe if you have time.
Yeah.
So I guess, can you tell us more about open source and how an OSPO works within? Like, we have David here, and I get that. But I guess I still don't see, like, how does an OSPO work in a private organization?
Yeah. No, that's a good question. So for us, um, being in a private organization, sure, we have like a lot of regulations and stuff, but at least working in the organization that I work in, right? So Capital One, there's a lot of regulations and risks, right? And so for us, I think that makes it a little different than maybe other OSPOs, but it's we all use open source technologies for so many different products, I like at Capital One or just in general, right? Like open source is the foundation for everything. Um, Tons of dependencies and stuff and so on. So the focus for us is making sure that the teams that are using these technologies are also not just consuming, but being good open source citizens, right? And just as a company as a whole, right? Like, sure, we use all of these, open source technologies or things, um, and we don't care. Like sometimes they go, dependencies become out of date, whatever, they become super vulnerable, and we just like drop them and let them go. What we're trying to do is make sure that if people are using things, and they're required or they're like a critical dependency to teams, well, you should also contribute back, right? And lessen the behavior of, well, I want to use this open source thing. Cool, like, but open source like contributions, that's super hard. Let me just like fork this thing and maybe make that little change that I want to make, and then I have this like complete replica with like two changes, right? So making contributions easier, and increasing contributions to those, to those critical projects, but having everyone understand that they're using this stuff, they should become a part or at least like support it in some way, right? Maybe it's not contributions, maybe it's sponsorship. But that's the problems and the things that we're trying to solve, from an OSPO, like inside of a private organization.
How do you,
I guess my follow-up to that, like, what does that look like on a daily basis? Again, I can see David and what he does in trying to get students and trying to get programs going and grants. But I'm trying to figure, like, what does a daily look like of that? Is it like you go to meetings and talk about it?
Um, so we have a couple tools, and there's a we're sunsetting our old contribution tool, which enabled people to make those contributions without releasing our secrets. We're replacing that tool with something else. So a lot of our time is spent developing that tool. And we've partnered with the GitHub OSPO, because they created a GitHub app and some other functionality, a UI, that makes it nice to synchronize forks between GitHub Enterprise like versions and public GitHub. So we're using that functionality to make it easy for when that synchronization happens. So we create mirrors of the forks. When someone makes a contribution, we can scan that contribution. So our tool will, scan for secrets and whatever, and do a bunch of things, and we can then block the whatever if something's happening. Or we can just allow those contributions to take place. So that's one piece, which is enabling contributions, whether that's like through our tool or the maintenance of our tool, and working with other, external OSPOs to make that a thing. Um, we have our whole sponsorship group, which is we have projects that people want to open source at Capital One, but we also want to, sponsor projects, external projects at Capital One. So there's the whole evaluation process that happens there, and going through the whole like legal and brand reviews that need to take place before a project can go to the Capital One public GitHub and be a sponsored project. And then there's the whole ingestion risk reducing piece, which is like that critical dependency. So we have tools that will score the risk of certain dependencies that we have that are internal, and that gives an output to like a developer, right, during a build. Like, hey, you're actually using end of life software, or you're using whatever that has 10 CVEs open, whatever it is. It's making sure that people aren't deploying software that has security gaps and stuff. But we maintain like all of these tools, we build all of these tools. And then yeah, there's the foundation piece where we have people who are working with different foundations and trying to make a change and partner there with those foundations as well.
Okay, very helpful.
I know Google at one point was doing like a 1 day a week. You could work on any project. Does Capital One have something like that, or does the OSPO like encourage that kind of freedom in any way?
Yeah, we're currently working on trying to increase contributions to projects in general, but first focusing on increasing contributions to those critical projects slash dependencies. So we had these contribution days that we've hosted and we've given out, swag, whatever, and people can make contributions. So there's things that we've done to try to do that. For us though, the problem that we see is, people can join this contribution day and maybe they're like a first time contributor. Uh, and they don't really know what to do. So, 8 hours is not enough, right, for them to actually create something or, or make a contribution. It's like this like long, almost like, mentorship type process that we may need to take right with people. So that's what we're trying to figure out now. How do we, because that those days work for people who have already been contributing. But how do we get those first time contributors or people who might be, you know, scared to contribute? Maybe they don't know, or they don't even know it's an option. Instead, they go and they use their personal computer to make their contributions because they had no idea. So yeah, so that's a problem that we're trying to solve.
I'm also fascinated by, did you have a challenge with management? Like quarterly profits are what drive companies. So how do you rationalize all those corporate words like return on investment? The feel good part of it, like in my heart is, yeah, I want my old company, Leidos, was a horrible taker of open source and not giving back in any way. Lawyers said, we can't share our IP. I'm like, but you're taking, let us contribute back. We depended on these, all those arguments, but we never even got anywhere. We didn't even have an OSPO. So how did you get to like, okay, at least you have an OSPO and then giving you time and resources and, how do you make that case and win them over?
Yeah. So what I've been what I've been helping the team do now is find a way to like talk that corporate speak, right? So we can get more time, more people, more funding for certain things. Especially more funding just to literally just sponsor or donate to projects. But the way that you do that is it's what you said, right? You find out what's the thing that is important to them. Is it, you know, is it risks of for like Capital One or other places? It could be, oh well, if I'm using certain things, what's the risk, right? Of for for this project to become not a thing, right? Like the maintainers all leave. Oh no, like what happens? So finding ways to measure that. People like data, right? So creating ways to measure criticality, and then the impact of what would happen if this open source project just stops being maintained. And then what do we do? So that's one of the things that I'm hoping to figure out, which is to um, provide like recommendations based on a couple different attributes for different projects, right? And say, okay, output is you have this, dependency. This is at risk, requires contributions, requires sponsorship or whatever it is. But things like that, I think that's when you show people that if you remove the foundation, your house will fall. That's a pretty decent motivator. And that's worked so far. Just pretty much putting a lot of fear in them.
Yeah, I like that. Do you have anything you would like to share to students at George Washington University about, as they're thinking about careers in tech, you know, what they should focus on maybe in their studies or what they do?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, from like the interviewing perspective, obviously, algorithms, data stuff, that's one piece. But once you get past that part, and you join and you're a whatever, a software engineer or something at some place, I think the biggest thing that I would want people to remember is you may enjoy being a front end engineer, right, for a couple years, and that's really cool, but you don't have to be that forever. Like there's the idea that you go, you get this job, you interview for it, and that's it. That's your life. You're done. You can't change careers. Oh no, like what am I gonna do? And then like 5 years in, you're like super interested in data, right? Analytics or something. You want to be you wish you could be something new. Um, don't be scared to learn new things. The more you know, the more in the stack, or the more technologies that you can work in, that just makes you more and more and more of a unicorn, right? You start to understand things holistically. Because if you're front end, you understand your front end, right? But if you can really understand how everything is working end to end, and then even get a little bit of product sprinkled in, right? So focusing on those customers or the end user, and thinking from a human perspective, right? Like when you're creating a button and the color that you choose for that button or the positioning of those buttons, um, they're they can be successful or not successful based on human mental models, right? So understand that you're designing for people, or maybe you're designing for a system, right? And whatever it is, just understand and always focus on the thing or the human or the person that you're building that thing for, right? And then I think that that's just something that some people might forget too. So yeah, just try everything and learn as much as you possibly can. It only makes you, stronger.
How do you, I totally agree with that. Every tool that I've ever built that succeeded, I was like talking directly with users and understanding their needs. And then every time it failed, it was because the users were too distant from the development team. Um, how do you, like for students, how do you get them to learn that? Do they, is it like a matter of jumping into an open source project and getting their hands dirty and coding, or is there classes or a type of way of learning that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stuff out there. I mean, even thinking about like cognitive psychology and how people even build like prototypes in their brains, right? Or heuristics or whatever, right? Like the idea of like perception and how one person can see some blob on the beach and it's a tree to me, to you it's a dead body, and it's like where does that come from, right? And just understanding just how the human brain works. I think that gives you a decent understanding of um how things could be different, but you then like learn that this is the way that pretty much everyone thinks for the most part, or how to build mental models, especially if you want to create something new. So just an understanding of just human thinking is like one piece of it. um, there's a bunch of like human-centered design stuff too that you can go and read up on, right? And like white papers and stuff like that, just learning about how like you know products, service maps, customer journey maps, like, and what that looks like, and maybe even trying to understand or create one. It'd be awesome if like there was a class that you can take, like at school, right? That's really cool. That would be a big plus. Definitely go do that. But then yeah, then you have to apply it. So like open source, working with a group of people that you don't know, I think is going to help you like use some of those skills. So talking to the people or the engineers on that team, right? Or maybe there's product people, right, who are helping that project. That would be awesome. Um, but understanding what that tool is built for, and then working with the other engineers to understand the requirements and requirements gathering, and then why are we doing these things? Yeah, I think that would be a big help too. But yeah, definitely understanding how people think, finding like design or human-centered design resources out there that you can like read up on, or take a class or both or all of it. And then yeah, and then practice whatever it is that you learned.
Awesome. Well, one of your superpowers seems to be learning and adapting to new communities. Do you have any advice on like how it can be terrifying to like go into a new community? You had obviously had like a horrible experience. I was like almost flop sweating as you were talking about the chairs being pulled away and nobody wanting to sit next to you. Like that. I just went to a conference a couple days ago, and it was a totally new community. It was a geo community, and I'm not like super up on geo. There's a big open source overlap. So I was like felt like a fish out of water. Do you have like recommendations on how to enter a new community and navigate that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's obviously differences depending on the community that you're trying to join, but one thing that I always think about is just, especially if I'm like just joining a new team, right, or whatever, is come in humble, and know that maybe I know, maybe it's an open source project, maybe I know this technology really well, right, or I have a lot of ideas on how to do things different or whatever it is, a lot of opinions. When I first join, I like to learn and observe and get to know how things are working first. So seeing what other people are doing in that specific space. So just talking to people, right? People will I haven't had moments where someone's like, "Ugh, no, I'm not gonna talk to you about myself or things that I do or my project or whatever. Like that, I've never had a meet and greet be declined. I tend to find that people really enjoy talking about stuff that they do. So that's one thing, like getting a solid understanding of like the landscape, what people are doing, and then finding those people by talking to people. It's That's where you can go and identify the ones that you want to make a solid connection with, um, and then go from there. So and then start to try to embed yourself in the different spaces in the technology, and then maybe comment. So like I'm thinking like open source, like if you have a project and there's issues, like maybe start commenting on things or like start helping with certain things, or then start to make yourself, show them that you're useful, right? That you're there to help, because that's pretty much what you're there to do, right? Help or learn or whatever. Um, so yeah, those are like the main things, I think that I would do. But if you see like signs that maybe, I feel like that's where you would also see signs if like it's like, oh, maybe this isn't a really good community that I want to join. I'm gonna step back from this. That's also another outcome that could come from all of that like research.
So are you a maintainer of any non-Capital One ones?
Yeah, I'm a maintainer of a GitHub project called Private Mirrors, the Private Mirrors app. Um, so yeah, that's the one thing that I work on mostly.
So in the fall, David had someone from P5JS talk about their role as a maintainer. And I thought it was interesting that she was discussing how little of it was technical. Like the role of the maintainer isn't technical anymore. Have you found the same thing?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of, sometimes it's like people management. So like we had a couple of big PRs come in that make like massive changes like to the project, and there were like no issues. Like they were just kind of like, oh hey, by the way, I think you should completely change your application. Like here's this PR. Um, so going in and like having to have that like conversation, like talking to people like, hey, maybe we can open an issue and talk about this, right? Like this is really cool, but let's have a conversation. There's a lot of that. So pulling people back from, implementation first, talk later. And then it's, yeah, talking in those issues or creating those issues, or yeah, like the most technical thing is, oh, there's like a new patch version for TypeScript or something. Cool, like approve, and that's pretty much it.
What's the app do?
That is the application that will sync between forks. So it creates mirrors of forks in different GitHub instances.
Awesome. I think I might need that app because I've been really struggling with different forks and how not intuitive it was for me to like be in the middle of like have a downstream fork and an upstream project and trying to
Yep.
do things. Yeah, so maybe I need that app.
Yeah, you should definitely check it out. It's cool.
Awesome. Any other questions? Anyone online have a question?
Doesn't look like it.
No.
Well, thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Awesome. That was great. We look forward to collaborating further, and maybe figuring out some internships and maybe some capstone project ideas that some of our students could help support.